They told me they loved me while they stole from me. I still hear my mother's laughter like a recording, bright and careless. The kind of laugh that makes strangers lean in and say, "What a lovely family." It was a Tuesday when the text arrived, a short, smug line that read, "We emptied the joint account. See you at the Ritz." My fingers did not shake as I typed back, "Good luck." Inside, everything did. My name is Emily Hart. I am 31, and I built a life by trading sleep for code, late-night pitches, and a stubborn refusal to let my idea die. My startup Loom lived in a converted warehouse in Ashford. It was small, fierce, and finally beginning to hum. The joint account, the one labeled family home and supposed to keep the white Victorian on Willow Lane out of foreclosure, had been my promise to my parents for years. I had poured tens of thousands of dollars into it because that was what family did, or so I believed. The text came while I was demoing a new feature to a prospective client. I smiled, talked rates and timelines, but my head was a drumbeat of betrayal. My mother Ellen and my father David were vacationing at the Ritz in Palm Beach with Claire. My sister Claire posting curated photos of cocktails and salt air. I scrolled through their profiles and found a beach house reservation that matched a charge in our account, a payment for $5,000 to a boutique travel agency. My stomach tightened. I did what anyone who had learned to survive in venture towns would do. I documented everything. Screenshots, bank statements, private messages. I traced charges to a credit card linked to my mother. There were hotel bookings, a first-class flight, a limousine rental. The account I had thought of as a lifeline for my parents' mortgage had become their secret vacation fund. Mini Hook. The group chat was the breadcrumb trail. One muted thread I had ignored for months crackled to life when I hacked back in and scrolled until I found it, my mother's message, blunt as a knife, "She won't notice until it's gone." Claire replied with a string of laughing emojis. I do not use the word hacked lightly. It was a lazy late-night trick with an old password and a phone I had long since replaced. I told myself ethics were complicated, that I was reclaiming what was mine. I printed the chat logs, saved transaction timestamps, and backed up every screen to a secure drive. I also called a lawyer I had met at a networking event, a woman named Rachel Monroe, who had a reputation for making judges listen to small-town injustices like they were federal crimes. Start documenting, she told me over coffee, not looking surprised. If they're withdrawing personal expenses from an account designated for housing, we can file for a freeze and a full audit. Her pencil scratched a note on a legal pad. Her confidence steadied me. I was no longer the gullible daughter. I was a plaintiff preparing for war. It felt like more than money. It was how they had always treated me, the reliable one, the one who worked late and flew economy, the one who missed family vacations to keep a company payroll. Claire was the golden child, engagements, parties, a steady stream of praise. My parents were proud of her in a way that felt like a place at a table they refused to set for me. Mini Hook. 2 weeks earlier, I had transferred Loom's operating funds to a new account. It felt like closing a door, necessary, quiet, strategic. I had suspected financial irregularities, but I had not expected the audacity of a vacation booked on my dime. I did not confront them immediately. I let the bank do it first. I reported the credit card tied to the joint account as compromised and scheduled a meeting with the branch manager. By noon, their cards were declining, their itinerary unraveling. My mother fired off a string of messages, condescending, venomous, and my father called, voice tightened with embarrassment rather than apology. I listened to his pacing grow audible through a cheap airport line. By the time I walked into Rachel's office with my stack of screenshots, my anger had crystallized into something precise. Rachel looked through the evidence, nodding. "We can file an emergency motion to freeze the account and seek restitution," she said. "You'll have to be prepared for pushback. Family law cases get ugly when cash and reputation mix." I left feeling armed. The bank froze assets by evening. Claire screamed at me the next day, her voice a mix of fury and wounded entitlement. "You ruined our trip," she hissed. "You always have to make everything about you." I forwarded Ruth's message from the chat, the plan explicit, and Claire's voice faltered. She hung up. The town reacted the way small towns do, whispers and alleyway sympathy. A co-worker overheard my phone call and passed it along. A local mom who ran a cleaning business texted, "Is it true your parents drained the account?" Support landed in my inbox like a second warmer tide. It felt obscene and delicious at the same time. An anonymous tip reached me from someone who said they'd seen Claire shopping for resort wear before the charges hit. It matched a dated receipt. The puzzle pieces fit together too easily. Court moved fast. The judge heard our emergency motion in a cramped municipal courtroom with a smell of old coffee and varnished wood. Rachel's voice was steady as she set out the timeline. Withdrawals, bookings, texts. My parents' lawyer tried to paint it as misunderstanding, as family money used for family benefit. The judge looked at the evidence, and at me, a woman in a too small blazer hand steady on my folder, and ordered a freeze. He demanded restitution, at least an initial recoupment. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt the weight lessen, as if air had finally been let back into a punctured lung. But there was a quieter, stranger aftermath. My inbox swelled with strangers sharing their own betrayals with messages from people who had been the reliable ones in their families and were tired. It was a wave that buoyed me even as it reminded me how far from shore I had drifted from the family I thought I knew. That night, a series of private messages arrived from someone using a different name. They claimed they had more bank transfers hidden in shell companies and offshore account, with a small pile of money funneled through a boutique flower shop. The sender said, "Meet me at the old pier at midnight if you want the truth." I stared at the message, breath held, and for the first time wondered if this was about more than a summer vacation. I drove to the pier because curiosity often wears the same coat as courage. Midnight at the old pier smelled like algae and old rope, the kind of place where secrets settle into the planks. The stranger was already there, a woman in a thrifted coat with eyes that did not flinch. She called herself Maeve. She slid an envelope across the car's console like she'd been practicing this moment her whole life. Inside were photocopies of wire transfers, invoices, and a receipt stamped from a small accounting firm in a neighboring county. The figures were muted and bureaucratic transfers described as consulting fees, home improvements, small sums that added up to a few dozen $1,000 siphoned from the family account. I felt both vindication and exhaustion. There was proof that the vacation was not the only transgression. It was part of a pattern. They had been siphoning off household funds laundered through plausible business expenses and friendly shell companies. At the bottom of a photocopy was a note in a shaky hand. They always thought she wouldn't look. Minnie Hook. Maeve said she had worked as a bookkeeper for years and had watched this family's finances for a decade. She had kept a ledger because she couldn't stomach the dishonesty. She told me Claire had been complicit, not always the mastermind, but a willing beneficiary. The next 48 hours were a blur of subpoenas, late-night calls, and the hollow echo of a family voicemail box that no longer felt like home. My team at Loom braced me with practical concerns, deliverables, payroll, and investor call, and in another life, I would have told them to hold the line. Instead, I answered emails, half-present, fingers moving on the keys while my head replayed Maeve's ledger. Claire's husband Mark called me one afternoon, voice tight with the awkwardness of someone trying to sound conciliatory and failing. You don't understand. We thought it was an account for all of us," he said. His attempt at solidarity felt fake. "We're not." He stopped, and I heard the sound of rustling papers behind him. I hung up. The town had a way of making everything public. A local lifestyle blogger posted a scathing piece about family responsibility, and the comment section filled with support and speculation. A neighbor I barely knew left a basket of scones on my office doorstep. The moral attention stung. Suddenly, the narrative was no longer mine alone. Minnie Hook. A reporter from a regional paper reached out asking for an interview. I declined. Rachel advised against public comments until the audit was complete. She wanted the legal compass steady before the social storm widened. As the audit unfolded, more anomalies showed up like bruises under the surface. Repeated cash withdrawals on days when my parents had claimed to visit my grandmother, invoices for landscaping services that did not exist. Payments to a florist whose business license had been terminated the year before. It was messy in a way that felt intimate and ugly. Private greed can feel like a stain. At home, my mailbox carried the small cruelties of family rifts, letters from cousins who had been pressured, vague messages from Ruth's siblings asking, Are you sure? One autumn night, a package arrived. Inside was a framed photograph of Claire and my parents at a family reunion, three faces sunlit, smiles easy. Someone had circled my mother's hand in the photo in red ink. Under it, in my father's looping script, a single sentence: "We did what we had to." That sentence lodged under my ribs. Mini hook. A late-night text arrived from an old friend who worked at the county records office. "Check grant number 338, she typed. I typed it into a public database and froze when a property lien showed up, a small parcel registered to my parents, purchased months ago, with funds dated to the same time frame as their siphoning. The purchase had been obscured by layers of paperwork. Rachel moved with the relentless efficiency of someone who had won cases and had the badges to prove it. She filed the motion for a forensic audit, demanded immediate repayment, and issued cease and desist to any third parties holding the property. I watched as she dismantled defenses with the deliberate care of a surgeon, and in the meantime, I set meetings with our investors. Loom could not wobble while courts and family crumbled. My co-founder Daniel became my steady. He never pretended to understand the ache, he simply handled the numbers, the servers, the day-to-day that kept Loom breathing. He would call at lunch with updates about conversion rates and user retention, grounding me with syntax and spreadsheets. Business, I had learned, was its own kind of truth. It did not care about family drama, only about metrics and momentum. Then Claire posted what she insisted was her side to a private forum. A placating, polished, long-form apology that blamed misunderstandings and accused me of orchestrating a public spectacle to shame them. It read like damage control written by a PR person. Her comments said she felt hurt, and friends chimed in with sympathetic notes. In the middle of it, I found a line that flicked the switch from anger to cold calculation. We were desperate, and sometimes families make hard choices. Hard choices. There was an arrogance to that phrase, as if moral compromise were a currency to be spent on luxury. Claire's apology included a photo of a receipt for a family gift, a necklace purchased the week before the audit began. The receipt did not match their story. The gift had been paid for with a wire transfer that traced back to the joint account. Court hearings multiplied. Each session added paper to my already bulging folder: bank statements, printouts of social media posts, photographs, invoices. Witnesses were coaxed into testimony, and the town's small morality play unfolded in the sterile language of legal procedure. At one of the hearings, my father's voice cracked as he tried to explain the transfers. He said we thought it would all work out. The judge listened, then asked for precise accounting. The judge ordered interim repayment and placed liens on properties connected to the transfers. It was a win on paper, but I knew legal wins do not always equal moral accounting. They do not always fix the nights where a daughter listens to the sound of her parents' television and wonders how people she loved could get so good at secrets. One evening, as I patched code and ate a sandwich at my desk, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Maeve. Her voice was hollow. "I didn't tell you everything," she said. "There's a ledger in Ruth's safe deposit box. It lists names. Some of them aren't family." The message ended before she could say more. I stared at the waveform on my screen, the silence around it louder than any accusation. Who else had they taken from the safe deposit box? Was the kind of reveal you see in films: a glinting metal drawer, a bored bank clerk, the hum of fluorescent lights. Ruth had rented it under her maiden name, a deliberate decision to obscure ownership, which meant accessing it legally required a subpoena. Rachel filed the motion not with bravado, but with the quiet patience of someone who has watched puppeteers get tangled in their own strings. We opened the box on a rainy Tuesday. Inside, among pressed envelopes and a locket that smelled faintly of perfume, sat a small spiral notebook with neat handwriting. At first I thought it was a gardening journal. But then I flipped to pages marked in red ink and found lists, dates, amounts spelled out in meticulous pencil names, abbreviated M. Hart, C.R., and then others with initials I did not recognize. A pattern emerged: money moved, people complicit, favors repaid with cash. Mini hook. On the back pages, Ruth had written acronyms for companies and what looked like coded descriptions: consulting, flowers, repairs. The ledger suggested a network of small vendors who had been paid to launder funds. And there, unmistakable, was a line item referencing a property purchase in a neighboring county, the same county my friend from records had flagged. I took photographs of the ledger with shaking hands. Seeing the handwriting felt like watching a private confessional. The entries read like a map of entitlement. My name appeared as Emily Hart contributions ongoing, and beside it a smaller note handled by Claire when convenient. It rankled. The ordinary cruelty of parental favoritism had been given a neat written form. Outside the bank, a woman approached me with measured steps. She introduced herself as Patricia, my aunt. Patricia, Ruth's younger sister, who had been quietly skeptical from the start. She had been a cousin in my childhood who smelled like lavender and always brought fudge. Patricia's eyes were red-rimmed. I had no idea, she said. I kept thinking they must have a plan. Her confession was both relief and a fresh wound. Family self-deception had been a shield for years. The ledger changed the whole legal landscape. Rachel subpoenaed the vendors and bank transfers. Auditors traced payments. Property deeds were re-examined. The more the ledger revealed, the more I felt like a historian excavating a family's decline. It was not that my parents were poor or desperate. It was that they had chosen indulgence over honesty. Minnie Hook, an auditor, called and said, "This is bigger than a misused mortgage fund." The shell company structure traced to a sedate LLC that had once belonged to a deceased neighbor. The money moved in a way that suggested premeditation. The audit uncovered transfers disguised as estate maintenance routed to businesses connected to Claire's social circle. Claire's social pages went silent for a week. Then she posted a tearful video apology that reeked of coaching. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said, voice shaking just enough to be believable. People scrolled and reacted with those small icons that stand in for sympathy. But there were Holes dates that did not align, receipts that were clearly forged, and a deposit to a florist named Marigold & Co. that had been paid before the charges were made. It read like a staged performance. In court, the ledger was a smoking gun. The judge's expression when he read aloud the entries was a kind of quiet astonishment. He ordered an extended audit, temporary restitution, and a hearing to determine criminal intent. My parents' faces were slack with disbelief. They looked like people who had been surprised that a trick had been discovered. I felt neither triumph nor mercy. I felt something cleaner, the satisfaction of truth laid bare. But truth has its own costs. Family fractures widen into chasms. A cousin who had sided with my parents called me a social assassin in a group message accusing me of airing dirty laundry. An old friend advised me to consider mediation to preserve family ties. My answer was simple and raw. How do you mediate with theft? Amid the legal storm, Loom signed a partnership with a Midwestern chain that would triple our user base. Investors called to say the traction was remarkable. The business rose like a tide while my family sank into a private storm. It felt like two lives moving in opposite directions, each acting as the cause and effect of the other. People in Ashford began to notice the small consequences of the courtroom decisions. Local charities that once received donations from Ruth's glossy fundraisers posted notes that events were being postponed. Mark's real estate clients whispered. My parents' circle, those glossy weekend brunch friends, kept a cautious distance. Reputation, once a currency as good as cash, had dwindled. I did not gloat, but I realized that justice is often less dramatic than we expect. It is a slow accounting. It is hearings and documents and the kind of moral clarity that arrives in small legal increments. The judge ordered restitution and a probationary financial oversight. They would repay what they could. Some assets were sold. A vintage car that had once gleamed on the lawn appeared on a for-sale list, its chrome dulled by necessity. An unexpected note arrived from an old teacher who had taught me rhetoric in high school. He wrote, "I always thought you were brave. Remember, bravery is often quiet." His words dropped into my inbox like a benediction. There were moments when I felt less like a person avenging a theft and more like someone reclaiming a life. One evening, while cleaning out Ruth's closet, part of the court-ordered inventory, I found an envelope stuck within a coat pocket. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of names, not initials, full names, and beside one of them was an address that led to a bank across state lines. At the bottom, in Ruth's handwriting, was one sentence: "If anything happens to the house, pay them." The list hinted at something darker than a vacation, a network ready to protect a certain kind of privilege. I folded the paper carefully and looked at the photograph of my parents on the mantel. For the first time, I wondered how deep the betrayal ran and how many quiet lives had been used to prop up one family's jealousy. The list in Ruth's coat pocket was a thin piece of paper that felt heavier than the weight of its fibers. I read the names with a slow, methodical patience, like a librarian cataloging a dangerous archive. Some were familiar: a neighbor, a woman who taught knitting down the street, and others were strangers whose names had the glossy ring of someone used to being trusted. Beside one name was an address for a bank in another state, the kind of place people used when they wanted distance from local eyes. I took photographs of the page and slid it into an evidence envelope. Rachel told me not to touch anything else without counsel present. The ledger and that list together suggested a network of favors, of quiet agreements to cover expenses in exchange for loyalty. It wasn't just theft. It was an economy of entitlement, a system lubricated by silence. Mini hook. In court, the list became Exhibit 11. The judge read the names aloud and paused at one, a name tied to a small nonprofit that had recently lost a major donor. This could be a pattern, he said, eyes on the attorneys. It was the first time the courtroom smelled like scandal instead of paperwork. Outside court, the phone calls multiplied. Journalists called with gentle curiosity, neighbors offered bread and condolences, and family members sent texts that tried to pretend nothing had happened. My parents' friends split into factions. Some wrote private messages of stunned sympathy. Others blocked me without a word. It was astonishing how quickly social intimacy could calcify into silence when money and shame were involved. At Loom, I tried to keep business as usual. We had a product roadmap laid out for the quarter and a sales funnel that hummed. My co-founder Daniel ran daily stand-ups like a lifeline: product, updates, bug fixes, customer feedback. It was in those small, rhythmic check-ins that I found an unexpected refuge. The work required a clarity my family no longer offered. It required facts and tests, not rumors and half-truths. Mini hook. One morning, a client who had been on the fence signed a contract that would expand our platform to 3 new locations. The win felt like vindication. It was proof that my life could grow even as my family withered. Claire's public persona shifted between denial and overt remorse. She posted a long statement about family complexities and personal mistakes, an attempt to reframe guilt as ambiguity. Friends left comments on her thread, offering comfort, some accusing me of being unforgiving. The comments section read like a battlefield, where civility had been peeled away. One evening, my Aunt Patricia called with a trembling voice. She had gone through Ruth's old address book and uncovered letters from people who had trusted my parents for years. They asked for help, and then they paid them back with silence, she said. Her words made me think of other lives I had not considered: neighbors who might have been quietly drained, relatives nudged out of responsibility under some polite pretense. The list in the coat pocket was an entry point into a web of quiet harms. Mini hook. An older woman, Mrs. Alden, from across the street, stopped by my office. She smelled of lavender and had the stooped grace of someone who had seen many winters. I lent them money once, she said. They promised to pay me back after the estate settled. They never did. Her voice was matter of fact, the kind of tired justice that had no patience for melodrama. I listened and added her name to the slowly growing folder. It was tempting to make this personal revenge viral: posts carved public shaming, a social media avalanche to watch their reputations burn. Rachel warned against it. Legal strategy first, she said. The court appreciates restraint over spectacle. The lawyer's caution was sensible, and it felt like another test of character: fight with law, not with fire. The legal investigations expanded beyond the joint account. Bank auditors traced payments to a small landscaping company that claimed to have serviced the Victorian on Willow Lane. But the invoices were padded. A florist, a boutique caterer, a local handyman, faded receipts suddenly looked like components of a larger deception. Each vendor had been paid through that thin pipeline of entitlement, and the seaside vacation was just the flashy headline. An auditor called me late at night with a soft, incredulous laugh. "You're right to pursue this," she said. "These are not one-off mistakes, they're patterns." As the hearings continued, my parents' circle began to fracture publicly. Friends distanced themselves, not necessarily because they believed me, but because scandal invites a kind of contagion. The private clubs that had once welcomed Ruth's bright embroidery now left empty seats at brunch. My parents' denial grew brittle and louder, a defensive clatter that sounded less like truth than like someone trying to drown out a sob. At home, I had moments of unexpected tenderness. My grandmother May, who had always been gentle with me, came by unannounced with a thermos of soup and a hand-stitched pillow. She smelled like rosemary and forgiveness. "You did what you had to," she said in a voice that had weathered wars and marriages. It was a small anchor, and it reminded me why I had fought not for vengeance, but for the quiet dignity of a home paid for with truth instead of theft. One evening, as I sorted documents by date and place, Daniel walked into my office holding a small, battered envelope with a postmark from a bank in the other state. Inside was a single check not made out to anyone I recognized, but for an amount that matched an entry in Ruth's ledger. The check was signed with a name I had never heard aloud in our family. Daniel's brow furrowed. "This isn't over," he said. I looked at the signature and felt a hard ice form in my chest. The name connected to a man I had seen at a fundraiser once, a man who smiled like someone who expected favors without cost. The signature belonged to a patron of local charities, someone who hosted galas and had been photographed shaking hands with city officials. His name, Jonathan Pierce, carried the weight of a community benefactor. Seeing it on a check that linked to Ruth's ledger felt like watching a theater curtain fall to reveal complicity on a stage far larger than our family. I brought the check to Rachel. Her face, normally unreadable, showed a flicker of interest. "This changes the frame," she said quietly. "If someone external to the family was writing checks, we have to ask why. Is this a pattern of payoffs or something more transactional?" Her mind was already moving 2 steps ahead. Subpoenas, depositions, the slow arithmetic of motive. Minnie Hook, a reporter from a regional paper, called, asking if I would confirm links between the check and the fundraiser. I declined. Rachel's voice in my ear was firm: control the narrative legally before the court of public opinion could twist it into caricature. Jonathan Pierce's name opened doors. Former board members of charities began to whisper. A list of benefactors surfaced that linked his firm to a string of donations and then to businesses that had received payments around the same dates in Ruth's ledger. It felt like unraveling a tapestry where the threads always led back to the same loom. Within a week, subpoenas were issued. Jonathan's attorneys were slick and polite, an entirely different kind of legal presence than my parents' flustered counsel. He denied any wrongdoing and called the checks a misunderstanding, loans repaid informally, favors asked and answered. The narrative he offered was neat and plausible, the sort of story built to survive casual scrutiny. Minnie Hook, a whistleblower from one of Jonathan's nonprofits, reached out anonymously with a stack of emails that suggested a cash flow pattern consistent with the ledger. The emails hinted at a culture of reciprocity, where favors were currency and accountability was optional. The courtroom drama escalated. Testimonies wove a complicated picture of community ties and blurred boundaries. Some witnesses offered shaky recollections. Others, like the anonymous whistleblower, spoke with the clarity of someone who had been keeping time on a clock that everyone else refused to read. The more evidence Rachel presented, the more the veneer of benevolence peeled away. I found myself watching how power operates in polite societies. People with money often build institutions as living proof of their virtue. It is easier to give a check and receive a framed photograph than to reckon with the quiet erosion of someone's savings. In cross-examination, Jonathan's testimony, practiced and courteous, cracked when presented with emails that tied his office administrator to transfers that matched entries in Ruth's ledger. Outside court, the community's reaction was a study in contradiction. Some were outraged that a benefactor might be involved. Others, who had themselves benefited from Jonathan's largesse, clutched their pearls and whispered about cancel culture. Moral courage, I realized, is often defined by whether people are willing to lose a social advantage to do the right thing. Mini Hook. An internal audit at one of Jonathan's nonprofits revealed discrepancies large enough to trigger federal attention. The news arrived like a thunderclap. I felt both vindicated and chilled. The scale of what my parents had been part of was expanding into something almost institutional. At home, the fallout took private forms. Family gatherings stopped. Ruth and my father retreated into a smaller world of old friends who still answered their calls. Claire issued public apologies that grew more hollow and rehearsed as time went on. Her private messages, which once overflowed with coquettish emojis, went silent. The silence was a language I had not expected to dominate my days. Amid the chaos, my work at Loom became a refuge and a responsibility. Our team's growth required a leveling up of infrastructure and a focus that left me little room for self-pity. Investors popped into meetings impressed by our traction and our resolve. One evening after an investor dinner, Daniel pulled me aside. "People respect what you stand for," he said. "You've kept the company steady through everything." His praise was a balm. We launched an update that improved client onboarding by a small but meaningful margin, and user engagement jumped. The tiny triumph made the weeks of courtroom procedures feel like a shadow at the edge of my days. Then came the summons that shifted everything, a grand jury subpoena for financial records tied to Jonathan's nonprofits. A federal investigation was looming. The scale of inquiry shocked even Rachel, who had navigated complex cases before. Suddenly, the theft from our joint account was no longer a family matter. It had become part of a larger web of alleged corruption. I felt a strange mix of responsibility and powerlessness. On one hand, I had initiated the chain of events that led to truth and accountability. On the other, the scope of inquiry meant lives beyond my family were being exposed to public humiliation. I wrestled with a kind of moral vertigo. To pursue justice was also to shatter illusions. Mini Hook. An unexpected letter arrived from a woman named Lillian, whose husband had been a longtime donor to Jonathan's causes. She wrote with trembling clarity, "If you have evidence, keep going. We owe someone the truth." Her letter reminded me that the world had other victims who had not yet found their voice. The federal inquiry widened the net. Subpoenas reached distant vendors, accountants, and charity boards. The press began to call Jonathan's philanthropic image into question. Donations were frozen, gala invitations rescinded. The philanthropic culture that had once shielded him began to erode. At home, the pressure took a physical toll. My father's hands shook when he brewed coffee. My mother's laugh had the brittle edge of someone who feared exposure. They began to talk in whispers, as if secrecy could still stitch their world. Claire reached out once timidly to suggest mediation and counseling. Her words smelled like regret, but they were wrapped in a plea for normalcy I could not provide. One night, I received an anonymous package at my office. Inside was a thumb drive labeled "Only with a date." I plugged it into a secure machine and watched a folder open containing a string of voice memos, recordings of private conversations between Jonathan and someone whose voice I recognized immediately, my father. The recordings were candid, businesslike, and devastating. In one, my father casually mentions an arrangement to cover certain expenses. I hit replay and realized this was no longer just about a vacation. It was about a bargain struck in the shadows, and I was holding the evidence. The voice memos felt like a trapdoor I had not known existed beneath our family's life. My father's voice, usually round and comfortingly banal, sounded small and ordinary in the recordings. He spoke of arrangements of helping out when things got tight, as if the theft had been nothing more than a bookkeeping hiccup. Jonathan's voice was calm, measured, riddled with the casual authority of someone who negotiated favors like currency. I took the drive to Rachel's office in a kind of stunned clarity. The thumb drive sat between us like a hand grenade. "This will redefine the narrative," she said, her eyes steady. "We can use this to compel testimony and to show intent." Her legal mind translated the emotional gravity into evidentiary value. My own reaction was quieter, a hollowed-out turning of my stomach. Mini Hook. Rachel ordered forensic analysis of the files and traced the metadata. The archive had been created around the same time Ruth had booked the beachfront rental. The coincidences stacked into a pattern that felt less like fate and more like orchestration. We filed the memos with the court and provided copies to federal investigators. The recordings complicated the defense's claims of misunderstanding. If intent could be demonstrated if the conversations showed deliberate coordination, then the legal implications deepened. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from local scandal to criminal inquiry. Press coverage turned sharper. Local anchors replayed snippets of the memos with legal experts parsing intent like a forensic linguistics panel. Friends who had been neutral picked sides, and more than one lunch invitation evaporated. Some colleagues offered guarded support, others kept a professional distance. The personal cost of truth was showing itself in everyday smallness. Mini hook. An editorial in a regional paper asked a blunt question. How many times can communities excuse small betrayals until they compound into institutional corruption? The piece connected my family's story to broader patterns, and the response was electric. People called with stories of betrayal they had hidden for years. Rachel maneuvered with the precision of someone who understood that high-profile cases demand legal accuracy and stamina. Depositions unveiled a tangle of excuses and evasions. Jonathan claimed ignorance. Vendors claimed clerical errors. My parents gave versions that shifted like sand. Under oath, though, memory is brittle. Documents and voice memos do not forget. The stress of being at the center of this public unraveling affected my work life in subtle ways. Meeting schedules expanded, investor calls lengthened, and my sleep thinned. Yet Loom's progress continued. We launched a pilot with a regional grocery chain that increased our market penetration and drew attention from a national conference. I found strange solace in the fact that the thing I had built, had integrity that could be measured by metrics instead of sentiment. Mini hook. Daniel sent me a message at 2 in the morning. You're doing the right thing. The small affirmation nudged me onward. It was easy to feel like a zealot. It was harder to be reassured by allies who understood the cost. In the middle of depositions, my grandmother fell ill. May's hospital room smelled like antiseptic and lemon. She grasped my hand with the frailty of someone who had lived a full life and wanted to say something last. You are not wrong, she whispered, her voice thin. Her affirmation was both simple and monumental. It crystallized my sense that this fight was about more than money. It was about truth and dignity. As the federal probe intensified, new subpoenas reached distant banks. Paper trails emerged that connected Jonathan's firms to transfers routed through shell entities. The more we uncovered, the more the defense scrambled for narratives. Jonathan's legal team tried to pivot publicly, highlighting his philanthropic contributions while privately arguing the memos were out of context, but the metadata and the corroborating invoices were hard to dismiss. An unexpected ally appeared in the form of a former employee of Jonathan's who testified about internal practices that corroborated the ledger. Her testimony felt like a light in a dim room. She spoke plainly about how donations were sometimes used as cover for private benefits. At home, the fracture in family ties deepened. My parents moved into a smaller house a few neighborhoods over. The Victorian on Willow Lane went into probate discussions, and neighbors debated the ethics of ever trusting them with funds again. Ruth's social standing dissolved faster than any of us had predicted. Claire issued a video that attempted to reclaim empathy, but ended up sounding rehearsed and hollow. Even so, there were moments of human complexity. Ruth called me once, voice thin with regret. I am sorry, she said, not asking for forgiveness, but offering a concession that was real. I listened, and it was not cathartic. Forgiveness, I had learned, is complicated. It is not a one-time act, but a slow reweaving of trust that both parties must commit to. Just as the case seemed to be winding into a decisive phase, a package arrived at my office, containing a photograph. It was a candid shot of Claire and Jonathan in an intimate conversation dated months before the memos. On the back, in a neat, unfamiliar hand, were the words, "They planned the getaway together." The photo contradicted Claire's testimony about ignorance. I ran my thumb over the glossy edge, feeling the sudden unsteady flare of the final push toward truth. The next hearing would be the most consequential yet. and I realized with a steadiness that felt like gravity the moment of reckoning had arrived. They did not only steal money, they tried to steal the story too. After the photographs surfaced, Claire and Jonathan in that quiet, conspiratorial conversation, everything accelerated. Claire's counterattack was not a single move. It was a choreography of distraction and narrative control. She hired a crisis consultant who polished her statements into a sequence of carefully human moments, tearful confessions, references to therapy, promises to repay, pleas for privacy. The spin was expert work. It smelled faintly of rehearsed grief. I watched the performance with a clinical distance that surprised me. Part of me wanted to storm every camera and shout the ledger's truth into the air until no one could ignore it. But Rachel kept me tethered to procedure and evidence. People will judge the delivery, she said, but the documents tell the long story. So I let the law speak where my voice could be mistaken for anger. Minnie Hook, Claire's consultant, arranged a staged interview that ran the week before the hearing. She spoke about mistakes and family pain. A charity she had supported posted a forgiving note. A few neighbors publicly expressed empathy. I felt the ground shift under me as if empathy could be leased to the highest PR bidder. Behind Claire's public contrition, something darker unfurled, an affair that reeked of entitlement and strategy. The photograph captured them, leaning in heads close, the kind of proximity that suggests private arrangements. My investigative thread, led by auditors and the anonymous whistleblower, uncovered a pattern of late-night texts and rendezvous logged on calendar entries that had been synchronized between personal devices. Claire and Jonathan had not only discussed vacations, they had been collaborating in ways that, once documented, would undermine every claim of ignorance. The betrayal cut twice. Claire had been the sister I remembered at slumber parties and bake sales. That we could now imagine her as an architect of our humiliation made each memory taste like betrayal. And Jonathan, the man whose name was attached to plaques on cultural centers and whose smiling face hovered in magazine photographs, was a reminder that people will wear philanthropy like a mask and keep a ledger of favors for themselves. Minnie Hook. A private investigator delivered text transcripts that showed Claire discussing who to notify and what to say in the days leading up to withdrawals. She even coordinated with a small circle about how to frame the payments as loans repaid in later donations. There was calculation in the messages. There was no accident. As the texts and memos hit the files, our legal position strengthened. Rachel moved swiftly, adding the new evidence to the motion for criminal hearings. The judge allowed the latest documents into the record. Jonathan's lawyers pushed back, arguing the messages were personal and taken out of context. But context is the scaffolding of truth, and the pattern was beginning to feel incontrovertible. Coordinated withdrawal, coordinated explanation, coordinated cover-up. At home, the fracture took more intimate forms. A cousin I had once trusted called to say Claire had given her a small gift and warned her not to get involved. "We're trying to keep the family together," she said, voice pleading for normalcy. I longed to tell her that family is not kept together by theft. It is kept together by honesty and respect. Minnie Hook. In a late-night deposition, Claire broke. She admitted to meeting Jonathan but insisted it was personal, not transactional. Her voice trembled in ways that sounded plausibly raw. Yet the ledger, the memos, the synchronized calendar entries, those kept speaking louder than her words. Under oath, frankly, a curated performance is vulnerable to contradiction. The twist that made my stomach drop came from Maeve, the woman who had first shown me the ledger at midnight on the pier. She called with a breathless urgency. "There's more in Ruth's things," she said. "A will dated years ago with a clause that worries me. It names Claire as a caretaker of some assets with broad discretion. A will could be innocent, a family document written in trust. Or it could be a map of how privilege is redistributed. The existence of such a document suggested planning that reached beyond a vacation." Rachel obtained a copy of the will and read it with the concentration of someone parsing legal poetry. Ruth, in her neat hand, had left conditional disbursements, small sums to neighborhood friends, a trust for a pet, and a large discretionary allotment that named Claire as administrator in certain conditions. The language was vague enough to be abused and specific enough to be suspicious. It read like an invitation more than a protection. Mini hook. The will was dated years prior to the withdrawals. If the discretionary clause had been used to redirect household funds, the timing suggested foresight. It was a legal seam that could stitch together the ledger's ink into a broader pattern of intent. Emotion in court is not always loud. Often it is a quiet knuckle at the edge of a table, a breath held between questions. The judge asked pointed questions about the will and its potential role in how assets had been moved. Jonathan's counsel argued that philanthropic donations and estate planning were unrelated to transactional impropriety. Rachel pointed to overlapping dates and to gifts that corresponded with ledger entries. Outside the trial theater, people wrestled with their own small ethics. A neighbor who had once admired Ruth's charity refused to fill a seat at Claire's fundraiser. Another who had benefited from Jonathan's largesse quietly returned a plaque. The social ecosystem that had cushioned Ruth and Jonathan began to dissolve in splinters. Public support is fickle when power reconfigures. Mini hook. A former trustee of one of Jonathan's nonprofits reached out to me privately saying she had felt uncomfortable with off-book transactions but had been persuaded by charm and assurances. She asked if she could testify. Her willingness reminded me that courage often grows in the small cracks of conscience. By the time the hearing on the will and the memos arrived, I had rehearsed my testimony in ways that were less theatrical and more factual. I thought of my grandmother's hands, maize soup, and the way truth felt like a mantle heavy with responsibility. I did not want revenge for spectacle. I wanted restitution and a restoration of dignity. Cliffhanger. In the middle of the hearing, as Claire took the stand, a last-minute motion was filed by Jonathan's lawyers asking the judge to consider new testimony from a person with claims that could exonerate Claire. The counsel's face was composed. The courtroom held its breath. The name on the motion was one I had never expected to read aloud. In that room, Robert Halloway, Claire's husband. As whispers threaded through the gallery, I looked at Claire and saw two possibilities: confession or collapse. The next moments would decide which. Husband as shield, husband as sword. The courtroom thrummed with the drama of an intimate betrayal played on public stage. Robert Halloway's testimony was a pivot. He painted a picture of a family frantic about mortgage pressures, of phone calls and pleading notes, of Claire caught in a web where her parents had requested help and she had responded like any daughter would. His voice rarely wavered. He spoke with a steady sincerity that had the ring of careful practice. He claimed ignorance of any conspiracy, and he framed Claire as the daughter who had been manipulated. For a moment, the narrative tilted. Some in the gallery softened. Others who had read the ledgers watched with skeptical eyes. Robert's defense suggested that Claire had not been the architect, but rather a beneficiary misled by her parents, the youngest marionette pulled by older hands. Mini hook. Under cross-examination, Robert's account began to fray. A line of texts introduced into evidence showed him coordinating with Claire about payments and mentioning Jonathan in a way that made the judge look up. The image of a husband as innocent bystander dissolved into something messier. What the transcripts revealed was not a single betrayal, but a network of enabling spouses, neighbors, vendors, all caught in the mechanical rhythm of reciprocal favors. It dawned on me that corruption is rarely a violent cinematic crime. It is often a soft social deformation, kindness turned strategy, favors turned currency. At the same time, Claire's counterattack expanded beyond legal maneuvering. She worked the press with a litany of human interest angles, stories of joint childhoods, of the pressure of being a caregiver, of how she had been complicit out of love. Some commentators found these narratives persuasive, others found them performative. The truth lives in the seam between action and story, and Claire had become a skilled seamstress. Mini hook. A video emerged of Claire at a local shelter volunteering. The footage aired on morning shows with captions about redemption. I watched and felt the dissonance. Yes, people can be complex and redemption can be real, but redemption does not erase harm without accountability. Rachel kept the case focused. She laid out timeline after timeline, transactions, logged messages, memos, the will, and the voice files. The judge listened, then asked for a forensic accountant's testimony. The accountant's analysis tied the strings together. The discretionary allotment in the will had been used in conjunction with ledger entries funneled through small vendors and, in part, back into the social orbit that had sustained Jonathan's benefits. In deposition, Claire's tears were not enough. Under oath, the curated empathy cracked. She admitted that she had been aware of some transfers and had not asked questions because she trusted her parents. The admission felt less defensive than calculating. The omission of inquiry read like a moral abdication. Trust is not merely a feeling. In family finance, trust requires verification. Minnie Hook. A new witness came forward, a former personal assistant to Ruth, who testified about financial instructions left in a voicemail. The assistant's testimony suggested coordination that aligned with the memo dates. It tied the family's internal culture to the external transactions in a way that felt damning. Yet even as court filings piled up, human complexities surfaced. I found Claire's old letters in a box at the family home during one of the inventory visits. Some were tender and raw, pleading for approval and affection. They were the voice of a younger sister who wanted to be seen. It did not absolve the later choices, but it complicated the image, reminding me that people are rarely purely villainous or saintly. The community response bifurcated. Some rallied for public accountability, others pleaded for rehabilitation. There were debates in dinner groups and online threads, discussions about whether legal punishment could heal moral wounds or whether restorative practices were appropriate. I found myself listening to both sides less because I sought compromise, and more because the conversation forced me to interrogate my own motives. Minnie Hook. An elder in my church. A woman named Gloria pulled me aside after a service. "We must seek justice," she said, "but also mercy where it is earned." Her words were a reminder that the outcome would not only be legal but also moral, and that both paths would be hard. The hearing grew longer. Witnesses were called to account, and small lies were exposed as big patterns. Jonathan faced his most difficult days in public, and his philanthropic sheen peeled away as audits revealed corporate accounts used in personal ways. He pleaded ignorance. Some of his board resigned. His reputation collapsed, not because of a single act, but because his public virtue had always been a fragile construction. Just when the case seemed to be trending toward resolution, a new document arrived, an email chain from years earlier that had been hidden on a backup server, one that included a plan to shift funds under the guise of estate optimization. The senders included Ruth and Jonathan, and chillingly a name I recognized from a city planning board meeting. The contents suggested coordination at a municipal level, implying that the shadow net around the family might be broader than we realized. The judge called for a recess to review the material. In the hush of the courtroom, I felt the gravity of what the document meant. This struggle might extend beyond family and philanthropy into the very institutions that housed our public life. When institutions tremble, ordinary lives feel the quake. The newly surfaced email chain opened a line of inquiry that none of us had anticipated. It contained talk of smoothing transfers and minimizing local scrutiny, phrased in the kind of bureaucratic euphemism people use when they want to make questionable things sound ordinary. The presence of a city planning official's name suggested a systemic willingness to look away to make exceptions for those who carried social capital. At first, I felt an exhilaration that bordered on fear. Exhilaration because the pattern was clearer than ever. Fear because the more people implicated, the more entrenched the resistance would be. Rachel called it a web. I called it a moral bankruptcy that had long been gilded. Minnie Hook, a city council member, resigned after the emails were publicized. The local press called it a scandal that would reshape civic oversight. People in town began to ask uncomfortable questions. Who else had benefited from conferred favors? And what had we all accepted as normal? The courtroom atmosphere shifted again. Defense counsel argued entrapment and selective disclosure. Prosecution argued a deliberate plan to obscure. The judge admonished both sides to proceed carefully. Public meetings on municipal oversight were scheduled, and I sat through them like someone watching a slow-motion unspooling of things I had once taken for granted. At home, lines hardened. My parents retreated entirely from social life. Claire's social circle narrowed to those willing to tolerate distance. Gifts returned to senders, invitations evaporated. the social currency that had lubricated their lives dried up. Minnie Hook, a former volunteer at Jonathan's foundation, testified to a culture of casual impropriety where small favors led to larger exemptions. The testimony landed like a thud. People woke up to how easy it is to let kindness be the cover for self-interest. I faced unexpected moral dilemmas. Friends asked if I would accept a mediated settlement if it meant quicker restitution and less public humiliation for my family. Would you rather have money back and closure, or a public reckoning, they asked. The question forced me to consider what justice truly meant to me. Was it the money, the social correction, the truth held in plain sight? I found myself returning to May's hand-stitched pillow and the quiet dignity it represented. Meanwhile, at Loom, growth continued. We presented at a national conference and investors praised our resilience. The company was a living, breathing testament to focused labor. There were nights when I left court and walked into our office and felt a strange peace. Here was work that did not require moral wrangling beyond wanting to make a good product. Minnie Hook, a programmer on my team, Lisa, found an efficiency in our codebase that shaved hours of processing time. It was trivial in the face of the trial, but it reminded me that creation is its own quiet justice. Just as the case reached a fever pitch, the defense produced a surprise witness, a long-lost cousin who testified that payments had been authorized by the family as part of a complex private arrangement to shore up business relationships. The cousin's testimony introduced confusion. The judge cautioned the jury to weigh evidence carefully. It was a reminder that the legal system is a place where stories compete and where clarity is often messy. On the last day of testimony before deliberations, an envelope arrived for me at the courthouse. Inside was a single photograph of my grandmother, May, speaking with Jonathan at a garden party years earlier. On the back, in a handwriting I recognized as my father's, it read, "She asked for discretion. We promised." The promise. I felt the room tilt. The phrase suggested that for years, perhaps decades, concessions had been made in the name of family and social preservation. If truth is a single lane, history is a highway of detours. As the judge closed the evidence, I realized the coming verdict would be less about restitution and more about reckoning for my family, for our town, and for the fragile moral economy we had all helped sustain. The jury would decide soon, but the deeper question was already lodged inside me: could a life rebuilt from betrayal ever be fully whole? Verdicts aren't thunderclaps. They land like a stone dropped into deep water, quiet, certain, irreversible. The jury filed in just after noon on a Wednesday, each member carrying the worn-out expression of someone who had been asked to dissect not only evidence, but the moral architecture of a town. I sat between Rachel and Daniel, my palms flat against the cool table surface. My parents were seated across the aisle, smaller than I had ever seen them. Claire's eyes were swollen, her chin tucked against her chest. The foreperson stood. His voice was steady, but there was something in the cadence, the weight of people confronting the truth in themselves while speaking it aloud. For the charge of intentional misuse of funds, he read, we find the defendants liable. The word rang with quiet force. For the charge of coordinated deception with evidence of collusion, he continued, we find the defendants liable. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Claire exhaled sharply. Ruth's shoulders sagged. My father closed his eyes like someone accepting a truth he had tried to outrun. Minnie Hook. Then came the ruling on punitive damages. Not criminal sentencing, but financial accountability of a magnitude none of us expected. The judge ordered restitution not just to me, but to every documented victim listed in the ledger. Every name that had been quietly used and quietly harmed. The courtroom stir was immediate, hushed, electric. The judge spoke directly to my parents. You participated in a pattern that eroded trust essential to family and community. This court cannot restore relationships, but it can correct financial injury. The law must stand where trust has failed. Ruth began to cry, a soft, shaking cry that made parts of me ache, even while another part felt fiercely resolute. My father didn't look at her. He stared at the judge like a man finally understanding the cost of the promises he had made and broken. After the verdict, reporters clustered like crows outside the courthouse. Rachel shielded me with a quiet, firm hand and spoke for us. My client pursued truth, not spectacle. Her voice cut through the noise like a scalpel. She had been my anchor through the storm. As we left the courthouse, people approached. Some offered sympathy, others gratitude. An elderly man who had once trusted Jonathan's nonprofit grasped my hand. "You saved more than your own name," he said. "You saved ours." But for all the voices around me, my mind kept circling back to the photograph of May and Jonathan, the promised discretion. I needed to know what that meant. But that evening I drove to May's house. The sun was sliding low honey gold across the yard. She sat on her porch wrapped in a shawl, looking out at the hydrangeas. I saw the photograph, I said quietly. May's eyes softened. "I knew you would." She invited me inside, her steps slow, her breath measured. The living room smelled like lemon polish and memory. She lowered herself into her favorite chair. "Your grandfather had business troubles years ago," she began. "Jonathan's father helped us through it. There were expectations. Your parents inherited those expectations. I begged them to step away, but they believed loyalty meant silence. So they felt obligated," I asked. "No," she said, her voice suddenly firm. "They felt entitled. There's a difference." Mini hook. She reached for my hand. Discretion was supposed to protect dignity, not to enable deceit. "I'm sorry, you are the one paying the price to end a debt that never should have existed." I sat there for a long time, letting her words settle. The betrayal wasn't born in one generation. It had been layered, inherited, normalized, and I was the one who had finally cracked it open. As I stood to leave, May handed me a small sealed envelope. "Open this only when the house on Willow Lane is yours again," she said. "It contains the truth about your inheritance, the part your parents never meant for you to see." I held the envelope like it was a heartbeat. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The weeks after the verdict moved strangely, part quiet, aftermath, part rising storm. Restitution proceedings began. My parents listed assets for liquidation. The Victorian, my father's vintage watch collection, two accounts I hadn't known existed. Jonathan's empire fractured under federal scrutiny. Several nonprofits froze disbursements. Board members resigned. Donors demanded audits. Public apologies appeared like wilted flowers too late to bloom but laid out anyway. Claire's world shrank the fastest. Her crisis consultant resigned after evidence proved she had omitted significant details in her statements. Friends who had stood by her began sliding away, embarrassed by their earlier loyalty. Her marriage to Robert became public fodder after his contradictory testimony. A local gossip thread claimed he had moved out. When she finally called me, her voice sounded brittle and hollow. "Emily, I didn't mean for it to go so far." I closed my eyes. Part of me longed for the comfort of a sister's remorse. Another part felt the cold truth settle in. Remorse without accountability was just regret. "Claire, I said you had chances to stop. You didn't because the benefits felt too easy." She inhaled sharply. "Can we fix this?" "No," I answered softly. "But we can live honestly going forward. That's the only repair that matters." She began to cry, but unlike our childhood tears, these were not shared. These were hers alone. Mini hook. As restitution payments were distributed, new victims surfaced: small business owners who had provided services at discounted rates thinking they were helping a respected family. Each story knotted my heart tighter. Amid the legal closure, I kept working at Loom. The company had become both refuge and rebirth. Our new onboarding update went viral in niche business circles, and investors requested meetings. Daniel and I traveled to a tech summit in Denver, where attendees treated me like a symbol of resilience. I found it surreal. I had simply refused to let betrayal define me. Then came the day the Victorian on Willow Lane returned to my name. A court officer handed me the official documents while standing on that old porch where my childhood had been stitched together. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled like dust and memory. Sunlight filtered through curtains I hadn't chosen. I walked through each room: the living room where we opened Christmas gifts, the hallway where Claire and I used to race the kitchen, where May taught me how to peel apples without breaking the skin. Finally, I sat in my old bedroom and opened the sealed envelope May had given me. Inside was a letter. "My dearest Emily, you were always meant to inherit this home. Your grandfather wrote it explicitly in his earliest will, but your parents altered the documents over the years to reflect changing loyalties. They believed Claire needed more than you, and they believed you would be fine on your own. I disagreed, so I kept copies all the originals. If you are reading this, it means you restored what should never have been taken. This house was always yours. Build something honest here. With love, May. Tears fell before I felt them. It wasn't about the house. It was about the truth that someone had believed in me enough to protect my future when others assumed I didn't need anything at all. At the back of the envelope was a small deed transfer form dated decades earlier, naming me, a child, as the beneficiary of the property. They had hidden it. As I folded the documents, my phone buzzed with a single text from an unknown number. You think it's over, but Jonathan kept something from all of you. Check the basement. I looked toward the staircase. The house was silent. Too silent. The basement door creaked like an old confession. I descended each step slowly, my hand grazing the rail dust rising in small clouds around my feet. The space smelled of old wood, damp stone, and something harder to place, the scent of secrets not yet aired. Light from a single bulb flickered overhead. The basement hadn't changed in years. The wooden shelves, the stacked boxes, the forgotten furniture, a crate of outdated Christmas ornaments. But then I saw it, a steel file box, tucked behind an old wine rack. Its lid was dented rust, eating at the corners. It did not belong to my childhood memories. My parents had placed it there recently. I carried the box upstairs, set it on the kitchen table, and pried the latch open. Inside were documents stamped with Jonathan's corporate letterhead: accounts, transfers, payment directives, legal drafts. But the last file made my breath catch. It was a contract unsigned outlining a plan for my parents to transfer the entire Victorian estate to Jonathan's holding company in exchange for future financial assurances and ongoing familial support. Mini hook. The document was dated only a month before the Miami trip. They had been preparing to give him the house. My inheritance. The thing May had fought quietly to protect. My parents hadn't just misused money. They had been one signature away from erasing my future. When I showed the file to Rachel, her eyes sharpened. This explains everything, she said. This wasn't casual misuse. This was a coordinated effort to consolidate assets. This could change criminal classification. The file went straight to federal investigators. Jonathan's circle unraveled faster than any of us expected. By winter, indictments were issued: fraud, conspiracy, misappropriation. My parents received reduced sentences due to cooperation. Claire received probation and mandatory financial restitution. It wasn't triumph that washed over me. It was something quieter, like breathing after years underwater. As months passed, the town began to heal. Committees reformed, nonprofits restructured. The cultural center removed Jonathan's plaque and replaced it with a small inscription that read, "Integrity is the foundation of community." At Loom, we expanded nationwide. Daniel became not just my co-founder, but my closest confidant. During one long night of debugging, he looked at me and said, "You turned everything they used to break you into a blueprint for building something better." Maybe he was right. The Victorian became my refuge. I renovated slowly, room by room, letting each space breathe again. In the spring, I planted hydrangeas in the yard just like May had. One evening, while sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, Claire arrived unannounced. She stood at the walkway looking smaller than I remembered. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she murmured. I nodded. "Thank you." "Can we try again someday?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. "But healing isn't a performance, it's a practice." She wiped her cheeks, nodded, and walked away. I didn't feel anger, I felt release. When the sun dipped behind the trees, I opened all the windows and let the night air drift through the house. For the first time in a long while, the silence felt like peace. Then I spoke softly into the dark. I survived betrayal, I rebuilt dignity, and I reclaimed what was mine. Final. CTA. Natural Conversational. If my story stayed with you, tell me, what would you have done? Would you have fought like I did, or walked away? Share your thoughts. Stories like ours remind others they're not alone.